Greetings from the county line. Last week we were talking about natural law, that people all around the world have this peculiar idea as to how they should behave, how we should treat each other. We can't seem to ignore it. But despite the seemingly instinctual urge to do the right thing by each other, we often do just the opposite. These two facts form the foundation of all plain thinking about ourselves and our world. We generally know what we're supposed to do, but for some reason we do something else. Remember the guy with the broken down car? If that was me, broke down along the road, I'd want somebody to stop and help. Yet, I drove right past him on my merry way. What if this slight twinge that urged me to help was nothing more than the herd instinct, some inbred human nature that tells us to care for our own? A quality which apparently, given the fact that I drove on past, hasn't completely developed in me. An instinct is a feeling that we should act in a certain way. And of course, sometimes we feel a desire to help somebody. That's probably our herd instinct. But feeling a desire to help is not the same thing as knowing that you should help, whether you want to or not. Suppose you're out for an evening stroll when you hear a scream or a call for help. Do you run to the sound of the scream to offer assistance? Or do you stand at the curb, call 911 and get your phone ready to record the cops rolling up? Or you may just choose to continue your walk. After all, it's really none of your business. When something like this happens, it evokes two alternative courses of action. One is a desire to help, from the herd instinct, while the other is to err on the side of caution and stay safe, the instinct for self-preservation. But then, something else kicks in, a third element, which tells us to step up to the plate and forget, for the moment, about ourselves. Here's where instinct fails us. Whatever it is that makes us better than the other creatures of our world puts us in a position, at that critical moment of indecision, as a judge between two options, where we're forced to do one or the other. You have a choice. What is it that helps you decide what to do? What makes a stranger stop at an accident scene to pull somebody out of a burning car? New York City firemen to run up the stairs of the World Trade Center buildings? What would make a shopper use the last of her food stamp allotment to pay for a stranger's groceries? How do we know what's the right thing to do? Now, I'm not trying to split hairs here. If we don't have free will, if we're just animals drawn to satisfy our instincts, like sex, self-preservation, and eating, then the question becomes whether we're responsible for our behavior at all, or just driven by nature. That's what we used to call the law of human nature or moral law. From its vantage point, it always sees one action better than the other. We all have the free will to decide which is best for us. And we don't only know what's best for us, this free will gives us the perspective to know what's best for others. When you see a woman being forced into the back of a van, or somebody spraying an Indianapolis tavern with bullets, you know you're looking into the face of pure evil, and somebody ought to do something. I'm not trying to scare anybody, but there really are people like that. People who will steal your daughter and lock her in a closet for his own pleasure. People who would do such things are evil. They made a bad choice. But how do we know that? It's not a judgment, it's fact, it's true. We're all hardwired to recognize good from evil. Psychologists call this dual process framework of decision-making intuition and reflection. Intuition is often automatic. It comes naturally. When we're hungry, we eat. Most of us don't think too much about it. Reflection, on the other hand, is all about conscious thought, identifying possible behaviors, weighing the costs and benefits of likely outcomes, and rationally deciding on a course of action. With this dual process framework in mind, we can boil the complexities of basic human nature down to a simple question. Which behavior, selfishness or cooperation, is intuitive, and which is the product of rational reflection? Do we really have any choice in the matter? Or do we just do what comes naturally? We can't know what the right thing to do is unless we're free to do the opposite. Free will is so perfect, we can use it to become a monster or a saint. See, we're free to reject the truths that we're hardwired to recognize. There are monsters among us who see no wrong in stealing a gallon of milk or your daughter. As soon as you see that one instinct can override another, that free will can dictate one course of behavior over another. You're well on your way to admitting that there is a real moral law, different from our instincts, a law which helps us know right from wrong, even if we choose to ignore it. A lot of us make the mistake of confusing preferences with instinct. I happen to like chocolate cake, and I have a very hard time trying to understand how anybody doesn't. Just because something makes us happy, it must be the right thing to do, right? On the other hand, if we don't like to do something, it must be wrong. Well, that's not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm saying is that regardless of how I feel about something, I have the instinctual ability to know what is objectively right and what isn't. A lot of Trump supporters will secretly admit that he should probably be in prison. They feel like he was a good president, but objectively, he's always been a fraud and a con man. Likewise, a lot of Biden supporters will admit that the president's too old and feeble to meet the challenges of another term. They feel like he's been good for America, but he can't even be held responsible for his handling of classified material. In both scenarios, people are making judgments based on preferences and feelings, which has nothing to do with objective right and wrong. Right and wrong is a moral judgment and not just a statement about feelings. It's not a matter of personal preference, but instead acknowledging an external moral law, a law imposed on human beings by somebody else. It doesn't depend on my feelings, but my feelings ought to conform to it. As a society, we might have become more skeptical, more doubtful, more inclined to question everything. But the fundamental concept of an external moral law, the one which has been imposed on each of us since we were very young and our mothers told us to share with our brothers, hasn't lapsed into obsolescence. It's just shifted from being a concept that most people accepted and took for granted to being a concept that is often challenged. Now, I can see why. In a lonely world, people would join the community that collective negativity offers. Political rallies, like the Ku Klux Klan meetings of a century ago, are filled with angry, frightened, and bored people. But they're also characterized by a festive atmosphere, a sense of mutual belonging. Being negative also helps you look smart. Have you ever admired the intellect of somebody who wrote a scathingly negative review about a popular book, blockbuster movie, or a major religion? It's the bad news that seems to get all the clicks and likes. Intellectually insecure people tend to be negative because they think it demonstrates how smart they are. Paranoia is the opiate of those who fear they may be insignificant. The problem is that if you mess around with negative emotions are going to mess around with you, eventually taking over your life. Focusing on the negative inflates negativity. If you look at the world through the eyes of politicians and, yes, the pharmaceutical industry, you stand a better than average chance of becoming overwhelmed by self-perpetuating waves of fear, anger, and hate. You're likely to fall into an erratic spiral in which you become more likely to perceive everything as negative. Pretty soon, you find you can't trust anybody and think everybody's up to something. The next step is to allow your survival instincts to override your sense of natural law, good and bad, to go out and do to the other guy before he does to you. To make matters worse, negativity is extremely contagious. Is it any wonder our youth have become pessimistic, distrustful, and indignant? We can second guess all we want. we got the free will to question anything, but this concept of a moral law continues to have a tremendous impact on our society. It's the basis for our legal system, for every idea we ever had about justice and fairness, for our belief in human rights, and for many of our most deeply held values. Even if we disagree about what's right and what's wrong, we still agree on the principle that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and that it isn't just a matter of opinion or personal preference. Surely we can all agree on that some things are right and some things are wrong. Okay, so what does this tell us about our world? People far wiser and better educated than myself have tried to figure out the nature of our universe and its origin. Currently, there are just a few perspectives which are still seriously considered. I'm not discarding these theories, but there's one aspect of the universe we know for sure, and that's humanity. We not only watch and sometimes study human behavior, we have a deep understanding of the subject. Why? Why? Because we're human. See, we have access to the inside scoop, the intimate information, the understanding of what we should be doing. Imagine, if you will, that you've traveled to Earth from a distant galaxy to study humans, like almost any episode of The Twilight Zone, except in color. You can't communicate with humans, so you can't learn directly from us. Instead, to complete your mission, the only thing you can do is observe. You'd likely see acts of kindness, generosity, and compassion, and acts of profound cruelty, selfishness, and brutality. But you couldn't begin to understand why it is that people do these things, because you wouldn't see evidence of the moral law. You might see the consequences of moral law, what people do, but you can't see whatever it is which motivates us to do unto others the way we want them done to us. So what you're asking, does that possibly have to do with the Big Bang Theory? Well, if we can admit that one instinct can be allowed to override another, that a higher value can be placed on one choice over another, I think we're on the way to admitting that a real moral law, which is different than just instinct, constitutes the difference between what is right and what is wrong. This understanding has become instinctual, while sometimes going against our own best interest. So, we've come to the conclusion, using our own intellectual efforts, that since it often conflicts with our survival instincts, somebody or something is behind this moral law. What we discover through this process is something which may surprise us. We've actually already discovered at least two obvious pieces of evidence about that somebody. The first is the universe itself. No matter how it got here, it's beautiful and immense. If we didn't know any better, we might assume that it was created by a very talented artist, someone with a lot of smarts who made everything from design and with a purpose in mind. But we've learned from our own experiences with the human condition that if that's the case, this designer or creator is merciless and not particularly friendly. Our universe or planet, while peaceful and beautiful, is also dangerous and even a little scary. The second piece of evidence is the moral law, which apparently came from whoever also made the universe and which seems to be hardwired into our souls. This is an even more reliable piece of evidence than the universe itself, because the moral law is an internal experience. We can actually experience it through comfort and love, betrayal and guilt. By accepting the difference between right and wrong, we begin to see that our universe has purpose, our country a commitment, our community a function, and we as individuals have a responsibility to listen to that little voice which keeps reminding us to play nice. One further note, from a personal experience, I belonged to an organization one time that has helped form the character of millions of people around the world. This organization started really just on a whim when A British Lieutenant General named Robert Baden-Powell, a war hero of the Boer Wars, wrote a book for reconnaissance soldiers. Reconnaissance was a fairly new military procedure in those days, in the late 1800s. So he wrote a field manual for his troops and called it Aids to Scouting. Because these troops would often infiltrate behind enemy lines and they often had to live off the land, the book not only included ways to spy on the enemy, but it talked about identifying animal tracks and poisonous plants and what to do if you got bit by a snake or fell into a river. Well, General Powell retired from the British Army in 1910, and he was surprised to find that his book had gained quite an audience in the civilian population. So he wrote a second one and designed this one specifically for young people because he felt like they needed to know these things about the outdoors and nature. And that gave rise to the Boy Scout movement internationally. Powell eventually wrote the Boy Scout Handbook, and he included in that 12 laws that he'd also imposed upon his soldiers and which he had gained from the Code of Chivalry for European Knights and from the Code of the Samurai Warriors. Those laws are that to be a scout, you must be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. I'm sure that if anybody's watching this today or listening to it, many of you will remember those 12 laws. They've stuck with me my entire life. Powell died in 1940, and he left the Boy Scout organization in 1937. He was asked one time if Boy Scouting was a religious organization, and his answer was, there is no religious side to the movement. The whole of it is based on religion. Before he died, he wrote a letter to the Boy Scout organization, and he said, quote, "Nature study will show you how beautiful and wonderful things God has made for the world for you to enjoy. Be contented with what you have and make the best of it. Look on the bright side of things instead of the gloomy one. But the real way to get happiness is by giving out happiness to other people. Try and leave this world a little better than you found it. And when your turn comes, you can die happily in feeling that you, at any rate, have not wasted your time and done your best. Be prepared in this way to live happy and die happy. Stick to your scout promise always, even after you've ceased to be a boy. And may God help you to do it." The Code of the European Knights, the Code of the Samurai, the Boy Scout laws were given to these people by God, the same God that made you and made the universe and helped us all fit in together. We're going to have some fun next week. Our guest is going to be our National Defense Correspondent, retired Air Force Colonel Tim Cahoon, or as I like to call him, the Prophet of Doom. So I'll see you next week. God bless.